Essentially 1 to 1 and 1 to 2. When we're talking about that, we're talking about something called the U clock ratio to the mem clock. And that applies to both AMD and Intel, but it applies to them both in different ways. At the end of the day, it's the same exact thing, but different terminology. The reason why they use different terminology is because the architectures are slightly different. U clock equals half M clock. At the end of the day, we have done some benchmarking in the past, and the difference between them is not that great. A lot of people always say, oh, you lose latency, or you get worse latency if you're running in Gear 2. So for those that don't know, Gear 1 is the top one, Gear 2 is the lower one. The easiest way I can explain this, think of a transmission in a car or on a bicycle. The gears on the bicycle, on a mountain bike, or the gears in a transmission, manual transmission, automatic transmission, doesn't really matter. The gears. When you shift into Gear 1, think of Gear 1 as literally Gear 1 in a car. If you rev the engine in Gear 1 all the way up and you don't shift up to Gear 2 and then 3 and then 4 all the way to like whatever your transmission is, you know what I'm saying? If you stay in Gear 1, you know what you end up doing? You burn up your transmission. You damage your car's transmission, and then you're in big trouble with a massive repair bill. Gear 1 is basically a thing that exists on AMD. AMD supports Gear 1 and Gear 2. Intel only supports Gear 2. Intel doesn't even let you do Gear 1. It's because they never designed their memory controller to be able to handle the extreme stress and pressure and speed that Gear 1 requires. Like I said, think of a car transmission. Think of how much torque force is applied to the car when you're in Gear 1. Intel can do Gear 2. Intel starts at Gear 2. Intel actually has something called Gear 4, which is really, really slow, and we're not going to talk about that, because if you're running Gear 4, you really are probably doing some kind of extreme memory clocking, like way above 8,000, and so AMD supports both gears, but you have to specify only one of them. You cannot say, oh, I want to be in Gear 1, and then we're going to upshift. No, it doesn't upshift. That's not how it works. It's not a transmission. It's literally just a gear, a single gear that you choose. Okay? So that's one thing. So Gear 1 is basically a 1-to-1 ratio. That means that my U clock and my mem clock are exactly the same. The Infinity Fabric exists in the IO die. Now, the fabric, if you're very old school and you remember PCs from like the 2000s, or maybe even older than that, but I'm thinking like, if you guys remember like AMD 64, Athlon, even the Phenom, and then eventually Bulldozer, you guys are familiar with that? AMD used to have something called a North Bridge. The North Bridge, think of the fabric or the IO die on an AMD CPU, a modern Ryzen CPU, as a merger of the North Bridge. Well, okay, no, because the South Bridge is kind of like the chipset, so we'll forget about South Bridge. So the fabric, the Infinity Fabric, is kind of what the North Bridge used to be like 15 years ago, or like way back, you know, a decade ago, because actually Bulldozer had a North Bridge. So yeah, like 10 years ago. The South Bridge is the chipset. Now we're not going to talk about the chipset in this because we're talking about memory. So the memory controller exists in the fabric, but to get to the memory controller, the cores, which are up here, to get to the memory, the cores have to go through the fabric, because the fabric is known as the Infinity Fabric. It's basically Thanos, the Infinity War. So you got to go through the fabric to get to the IMC. So anytime you want to talk to the memory from the core, if you're like, let's say you're core number 6 down here, you want to access the memory. You want to do a read or a write. You have to go through the fabric. The fabric then goes to the IMC. Then the IMC will then go to the chunk of memory where that data needs to either reside or it needs to be accessed. So when you're running in Gear 1 mode, the IMC, this thing, also known as the Unified Memory Controller, I guess we should use UMC. IMC equals UMC, Unified Memory Controller or Integrated Memory Controller. Okay, so that means Gear 1 means U clock equals mem clock. That means if you have, say, 6,000 megahertz memory. Let's say you buy a 2x 16 gigabyte 6,000 megahertz RAM kit. This is a very, very common, this is probably the most common RAM sold today for DDR5 for a gaming PC. Super common, very, very easy to run. You literally just load the XMP or the Expo profile and it just goes. Okay, so what does this mean? This means that the profile will program mclock to equal 3000 megahertz. Under this profile, mclock equals 3000. Why does it equal 3000? Because 6,000 divided by 2 equals 3,000. Remember that the true memory clock is always half of your advertised speed. Why is it that way? Because of the acronym DDR. Double data rate. Double data rate means that the advertised speed is actually a doubling of your megatransfers. So that is actually the megatransfer. So 6,000 megatransfers is achieved via a doubling of the memory clock, which is 3 gigahertz in this scenario. So when you're in Gear 1 mode, that means U clock equals mem clock. That means the IMC is in Gear 1 mode. It will rev all the way up to match 3 gigahertz. Now, this is something that AMD designed the memory controller to do. It can actually run at 3 gigahertz. This is something that Intel did not do. Intel never designed their memory controller to run at a whooping 3 gigahertz speed. That is very fast for a memory controller. Think about that. We're talking about a memory controller. We're not talking about a core. Cores can go up to 6 gigahertz now. But a memory controller was never designed from Intel to do 3 gigahertz. That's like unheard of. So that's the reason why they don't support Gear 1 mode. But AMD apparently they can do, somehow, magically, they can do 3 gigahertz on a memory controller. Gear, okay, so there is an if and an else if statement in the BIOS that determines this. So the way that the Agisa firmware is designed, the default is specified via an if and an else if statement. Agisa specifies if mclock is less than or equal to 3 gigahertz, then it will run Gear 1 mode. Else if mclock is greater than 3 gigahertz, Gear 2 mode enabled. This is the condition in the BIOS for every AMD AM5 motherboard to follow this rule. This means that if you install a memory kit that is rated for 6,000 and you specify the Expo or the XMP profile to run at 6,000, so in this scenario behind you, it's Gear 1. Yes, correct. You just do the math. You plug in the numbers. If I'm running 6,000, if I'm running a 6,000 kit, that means, remember what I said, mclock is half of 6,000. That means mclock is 3 gigahertz or 3,000 megahertz. That will apply the first condition in the BIOS firmware. That means the BIOS will automatically enable Gear 1 mode. Okay, you guys want to know what Intel's IMC is running at when they're running 6,000? Do the math. Do the math. It's an eye-opener. If AMD is running 3 gigahertz, the exact same kit. Let's install this kit in an Intel CPU and somebody tell me what is the speed of Intel's IMC when they're running a 2x16 at 6 gigahertz or 6,000 megahertz? Let's see if you guys can figure it out. What? 2,000? What? Hades got it. Hades got it. The answer is 1,500. 1.5 gigahertz. So when you take the exact same 6,000 megahertz kit, you install it in AMD, AMD goes and says, okay, it's less than or equal to 3,000 megahertz, therefore Gear 1 mode enabled. Gear 1 means 3 gigahertz. But remember what I said about Intel. Intel only supports Gear 2, which means Intel immediately will do this. The definition is right here on the screen. U clock equals half of mem clock.